This is Changeling the Podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the Podcast, where the masks are always wintry and the springs are always righteous. I don't know.
I'm not sure how I got caught up inside of this beautiful mansion with such noble guests, but I'm glad to be here and feel strangely compelled to stay.
That's the kind of thing that happens. Also, okay, so I'm going to try saying this correctly. Sawat wan songkran. I think is that relatively close?
That's relatively close. So, Kokuneka.
Huzzah!
Yes, beautiful having the water festival today, which opens with the solemn ceremony of pouring water upon a statuette and the urns of ancestors in the hands of the eldest members of the family. And then you have a big water fight.
Most holidays, I think, are improved by a water fight. Although it's a little bit weird that we're like recording the winter book on the springtime New Year day, but that's how scheduling works.
We're going to be talking about that later on when we get to chapter 3, which is going to be all about the weirdness of doing seasonal stuff when seasons don't work how you might think they do.
Yes. I think we didn't introduce ourselves either. Apologies to everybody listening. It's been a day. So yes, this is Puka.
And I'm Fetch.
And we are cracking open Winter Masques for Changeling the Lost First Edition. Before we crack it open, we need to talk about this cover. That hat in particular.
Okay, so what we got here is... Now, this book is titled Winter Masques, M-A-S-Q-U-E-S, as in a fancy costume ball. And this cover does appear to be a wintry festival where everybody's wearing masks underneath the boughs of what appears to be some sort of park. And while there's many fascinating people in the background, in the foreground wearing terrifying or awesome masks, enjoying a party, we have one figure in stark red who stands out. And Puka, would you kindly tell us about this amazing hat that could only be the most powerful of hedge-spun tokens?
It's kind of like if you made a beehive out of quilting squares and then enchanted it to put everybody else to shame. And it has like, I don't know, beads or something kind of trailing from the back. I want it. And if I ever cosplay as a lost character, I am going to be this hat-wearing, fierce... I'm sure there's some kind of entitlement she has. I don't know what it is. But the Crimson Duchess of... I don't know, Swank.
If I had the power, I would hold you to that pledge. Yeah, I like this one even better than Autumn Nightmares.
Mm-hmm.
But what's our book about today, Puka?
Well, so the back cover blurb says, this book includes extended information on the Seemings from their durance to new contract lists, greater detail on role-playing the core kiths and guidelines for crafting or customizing more, a look at changelings around the world, customizing their appearance and abilities to match culture or myth, 41 new kiths, 6 new courts, 3 new entitlements, and more.
That's a lot of crunch.
It is. It's a dramatic expansion of player options from what was in the core book. I'd go so far as to say that following Autumn Nightmares as an antagonist guide, but not precisely a storytelling guide, this one is more directly a player's guide in that it deepens the existing material while also providing new stuff. And a lot of what's in here, I would say, parallels the C20 player's guide actually quite. I was going to say quite well, but that would maybe be a more favorable opinion of that book than I actually have. So
it's a great player's guide. It is also something that I would recommend to storytellers because a lot of the details we're going to see about Arcadia and the true Fae and how to conceptualize everything that's going on are invaluable setting information that drastically redefines the impression I had gotten from the core book.
And a lot of the storyteller-facing material, there's a little bit that's purely for storytellers, I would say, and then a lot that's for both players and storytellers. So True. The Arcadian Realms, for example, from a player perspective, that could still be part of you describing the backstory of your character, exploring the durance, that kind of thing. But also a venue where a storyteller might want to set a session.
Shall we jump right into our introductory story?
Let's Do it. Also, just in the opening end papers of the physical book, there's this really cool wintry scene of like dead trees and stuff. It might be in the
Ooh.
PDF somewhere, but it's very arresting when you open the cover. Anyway, yes. Then we get a prologue.
Yes, our prologue begins with a fantastic picture of a dude just getting cracked right in the back
Yeah.
with a baseball bat. And that immediately makes you wonder what's going on. And we jump into a story that's going to feature one of the new elements from this, the courts of day and night. Now, Puka, what does it seem like is happening here in the first half of the story?
I'll admit this was a little confusing to follow.
Okay.
But yes, the character Velis is a member of the Night Court, which I can't say without thinking of the TV show, which is frustrating. Court of the Night. And he's being pursued by the Day Court, who capture and interrogate him. But then it turns out that he's actually the Day Court's own spy master doing false identity stuff. Like, it's a wheels within wheels kind of thing. Or rather, a shell game, which is the title of the story.
I enjoy the story and the numerous pictures that accompany it. To clarify what I think is going on, my understanding is the idea is that the Day Court, as we'll get into when we get to their chapter, they're high and mighty and maybe looking for an excuse to start something that seems justified. And so their spy master is trying to be like, hey, look at these horrible things that are happening so that we can then justify getting everybody on our side for a war. One thing I want to point out is there's a part where they knock Velas into a iron dumpster and that shuts down his powers. I don't think that's how that works because unless this where's this court settled in? It's
All right, so interestingly, it's supposed to be like Eastern Europe and Slavic influenced, right? And yet the city that they're setting the story in is completely nondescript. It's like a mishmash of places, and it's not a real city. I checked.
And I'll just say what I was going to say, which is dumpsters aren't made out of just iron. They're made out of like steel. So,
well, in nondescript city, it's
yeah, in nondescript city, all dumpsters are made out of cold iron.
Remember also, though, that we had the note when we went through the core book and read that cold iron was anything that was more than 90% iron, which is basically all steel. So I have to also say, though, even though I'm a little bit, I kind of raise an eyebrow at basing a story on information in the book that's all the way at the end. I love the iconography of the courts. It's like an immediate sort of beautiful thing that hooks me in. Like, ooh, what's the story behind this symbol that I'm seeing? It's like the day and the night court balanced against each other.
It is a cool symbol.
So yeah, it's definitely an engaging story. Just a little bit like, huh? We got the credits page. The authors are Don Elliott, Ethan Skemp, John Sneed, and Chuck Wendig. The freelance service Scribendi.com is the editor, and I'll comment on this later, but I think they should have done at least one more pass on some of this text.
Scribendi also did Autumn Nightmares, didn't they?
I think they did a lot of the Lost books and probably some of the other New World of Darkness books, but they're like a freelance editing service online. I don't even know if they still exist. But there's also this nice tribute to the artist Thomas Manning, who died suddenly before this book was released. And I wanted to point to, you mentioned when we did the quick start, the little dedication that they had. And I kind of like that they're using this credits page for dedications that are a little more heartfelt than cheeky, like compared with the old special thanks sections. They're enjoyable, but this is nice.
Yeah, it's sweet that they take a moment to recognize books like that.
Anyway.
So to the introduction then, we have a book about duality and diversity. Duality we're going to see in the nature of things like day and night courts or the... Wait, is that it for duality? There's something else about duality in this book, right? I say that, but I can't actually think of anything. Seeming and kith, I guess? I'm not sure that should really count.
Kith versus kithless, maybe?
Yeah. Well, we definitely have diversity, though, because we are going to be getting into a lot of backstories for these. A ton of detail for the kiths, numerous new options, and a bunch of new ways of looking at the courts system, both the one that we're familiar with and other ones that have only been referenced previously.
Yeah. I'm thinking about how Autumn Nightmares leaned into that connection with the Autumn Court about fear to talk about antagonists. But here the play on winter as a season of concealment and revelation and its connection to masks with a K or a Q, extrapolating from that into like this variety of kiths and seemings and options, I find it kind of forced. But if the framing of winter masks is the weakest part of this book, that's fine with me. One last thing that I would like to say about this is you remember how we had like 10 sample characters for each seeming in the core book? I was thinking, gee, I hope they give something richer than just more examples. And for what it's worth, I think they do rise to that with seeming specifically. The advice is very generalized before getting a little bit more in depth. And I think that was kind of the right approach with respect to these themes. So
I agree. While the book does have the same problem that the previous ones did, where it's too wordy or even repeating some stuff, there is going to be a lot of great new material coming down that's worth reading, even if you already get the general concept of what seemings, kiths, and courts represent.
All that being said, I'm bearing in mind as I go through this a comment that Pete made in our interview, where you can make something that is like a puka from Dreaming by using the Lost framework, but it won't be the same. And to the point which I think I've made before, the way in which cultures and folklores are presented differs through each game's lens. Lost First Edition, to me, it banks more on treating these beings as almost like varietals of an archetypal seeming. So this is another aspect that, relative to Dreaming, it's fine but different. I do think that the approach here maybe slightly disfavors stories that want to be deeply grounded in those traditions and myths, and the folklore connections that we're going to see drove that home for me. But we'll get into that. Anyway, then we get a cute story about ogre love.
Tell us about ogre love.
Well, I mean, ogres also feel love. I think that was a beautiful little tale here, this vignette. So.
I think a cute point about this is that it's taken from the perspective of an ogre who's being saved by this beautiful woman, and the picture gives it away, but the twist at the end is that she too is an ogre, emphasizing the fact that just because you're part of the kith that's associated with the big dumb brutes doesn't mean you have to be any of those things. That said, she does wield a mean baseball bat.
Beautiful.
She's got those muscle mommy vibes going. What can I say?
I recently finally got around to watching She-Hulk, and that was kind of the vibe that I got from this. But I guess it was more at the time, it was Shrek-oriented or something.
I just realized that person that she's beating up, I think he has a lollipop in his...
Every weapon for the Fae.
I love this game.
Anyway, Chapter 1, 6 Masques.
So we open with a discussion about the general nature of what seemings are like. Again, some of the stuff is repeated, so I'm going to spare us the things that I think have already been covered previously and just focus on the new points.
Yeah.
Which is, changings of each seeming have commonalities that stem from the durances they have suffered, the way their minds and bodies were molded. This impacts them now that they've returned, but it does not determine what they actually do. The point being that all beasts have a shared experience that unifies them in a way that makes them distinct from any of the other kiths, or even from ordinary humans. But that does not in turn mean that they are only what their durance made them out to be, which I think is worth emphasizing in a game that is very strongly about either rejecting what the Fae wanted to make you, or owning it in a way that they would hate.
Yeah. There's an interesting note here on the chicken and egg debate within the Lost community about whether seemings inform the person or vice versa. Like, are the Lost abducted for traits that suit what they eventually become? And I like that that is an unknown quantity within the setting that they lose sleep over or debate or whatever, because that ties directly into the approach towards things like the prejudices they might feel, the stereotypes they might have. A changeling in any of these seemings can be more than what their fellows from other seemings expect. And I think that this book really kind of wants to encourage storytellers and players to, I guess, do the unexpected when it comes to seemings. Like, people expect beasts to be wild and ogres to be stupid, so confound those a little bit.
I think that's a hugely important note. Speaking of the social groupings, they do emphasize that while it's pretty common for changelings to form social groups among seemings, kith groupings are far less common due to sparsity. You rarely have a situation where there's enough, wind wings or moonborn in one city to form any kind of organization. At the risk of getting ahead of ourselves, I want to emphasize something which is missing from this book that is a little disappointing, Puka.
Me too.
The core book suggested that there might be entitlements for seemings, or perhaps even of kiths. And in the book that's about seemings and kiths, we get 3 entitlements, none of which have anything to do with seemings or kiths.
And none of which are particularly interesting to me, but we'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, the thing which I thought could have used more words is, so like they have a section about the alignments between kiths across seemings. So like sometimes a certain beast kith will have more in common with a certain elemental kith than with other beasts. And importantly, this can be because a keeper abducts multiple people to serve in different roles. So it's a nice way to create those kind of orthogonal connections across groups. But it's a reminder that I would say an essential piece of a player's guide is to talk about the kind of intra-party dynamics, which we don't really get much attention on here. I believe Swords at Dawn might get into it more, but that's like way at the end of the line. So I think it's good to tell me, oh, your beast might feel more of an affinity with this elemental, but tell me about what that looks like. How does that shake out? How do their fellow kith mates feel about this relationship they have with potentially their motley mate? That kind of thing.
There will be a bit more about this when we get to chapter 3, when they talk about how sometimes they'll make cultural associations and just kind of group together different kiths and seemings and say, oh, this is like a kitsune, for example, without really thinking about the mechanical underlying of it. Putting aside for the moment of what we might need to say about chapter 3, I do like the idea that because kiths are so relatively unknown and hard to notice, like you can't always tell that somebody's a dancer, that you can have this cross-pollination where some changelings might associate without really realizing what mechanical similarities or differences they have, and choose to form groups that don't have any kind of mechanical impact, which, gosh, Puka, now you're making me really wish they'd gone into that, because that seems like a fascinating subject.
Right? The converse of that is with the piece on prejudice that follows it. Something that I do think is really cool they included is that an individual changeling may dislike a seeming as a whole because it reminds them of something from their durance.
Oh, yeah.
So if they were in Arcadia and their torture was a beast, for example, they dislike all beasts. That being said, prejudice rooted in personal trauma that's triggering is a delicate matter to roleplay, quite different from the kind of like socially structured prejudice. And again, I think that maybe could have used more words.
What did you think about the idea of the single seeming freeholds that they give a sentence or two about?
It would be interesting to explore, and I wish they had done more of that. But that's also, what's the Freehold book? Is it Lords of Summer? It's the Freehold book?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, so maybe we'll get to that. I have to say, I know you mentioned it already, but the writing style here, lots of saying the same thing repeatedly using words that might not be that different.
Last general point I have, they have a sidebar about changing fertility, where they add on to something they've said before, which is that maybe 1 in 100 changelings retain fertility. Their kids are normal looking, but bear demeanors similar to their parents' seeming. I've honestly always found the loss of fertility thing to be a little bit squicky, and one he's handling of what your children are like to be questionable. So I'm not sure I'm very happy with the sidebar, its inclusion at all.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it was meant to be some kind of comment on inherited trauma, like the epigenetic stuff, but shrug, I don't really need it. What I do need is a pretty regular structure for the seeming sections, and boy, do we get it. So briefly, before just kind of jumping into these, The way this chapter is structured is that each of the 6 seemings provides 3 sample Arcadian realms that they might have experienced and methods they might have used to escape them, basically sample durrances, the way in which the changelings were transformed, and a sidebar on how merits and derangements may reflect their individual scars, notes on how they engage with their surroundings and with mortals, their roles in a freehold, and a new affinity contract for each of them. So jumping into these, the beasts, the realms that we get notes on are the chasms under the world that produce skitterskulks, venom bites, and all manner of creepy crawlies. The screaming jungle with this really cool chimeric game hunter keeper. I want to use that one as a character.
The great multicolored prince.
Yes, it's amazing. And the stockyards that are basically a slave market.
Ugh.
So beast transformation is rooted in the conscious mind being subsumed into instinct, and they struggle to reassert their identities when they return. They are hyper aware of their surroundings in a sensory way, also a territorial way. And they have difficulty seeing things from other humans' perspectives, but have an animal magnetism. Their roles within freeholds can vary wildly depending on their kith, from enforcer to spy to liaison. And the new contracts they get are the contracts of the den, which, very briefly in order, allow you to sense threats in your territory, hide an entrance, bypass security to enter a residence, burrow out a safe space almost anywhere, and collapse a building. Kind of escalates quickly at the end there, but
yeah, that 5th power is brutal once you're at higher weird scores, or if you know where to place your character to cause maximum damage.
Carnage. Yeah.
Something I like about these in general, and we'll see this with the other seemings as well, is that a lot of these places that they have their durances at are more like cities than they are just one keeper's domain. So it gives the impression that Arcadia is more like a world heavily populated with these fae rather than a bunch of isolated fiefdoms.
My sense of it has always been that it is kind of, because it's Arcadia, it's kind of both at once. So it is very populated and very dense, but the border of the fief is always one step farther away than you think it is. Like space and density kind of lose some of their meaning. So it is simultaneously really densely populated and really sparsely populated.
The last note I want to make on beasts is that their transformation involves them losing human reason. That's the moment they know that they've become a beast.
Mm-hmm.
But it's then accompanied by the acceleration of their new instincts. And most only escape when they find something like a scent that triggers a memory. If that doesn't happen, they may not even think to escape.
Yeah, they just be. So why don't you tell us about darklings?
I would love to talk about our dark, edgy children of Arcadia. Their memories include the Black Oak Wilds. It's a creepy forest with an Iron Knight who hunts down people and challenges them to combat, then either kills them or puts them in his employ. Kind of just unsettling. The Well of Tears, which is the domain of the old man, who keeps treasures buried in his well and sets changelings to watch over it. And the Diamond Castle, a beautiful castle full of changelings that are chained up by the most wintry of winter queens, or so the book tells us. My note for what it's like to become a darkling is, and I quote, fuck around and find out.
Yeah.
You become a darkling because you see that sometimes people walk through this doorway and they don't come around the other side, and you think, I'm going to figure out how that works, and then you do, and then your prize for that is one of the true fae saying, you're mine now, congratulations, you're amazing. But while the keepers might appreciate your cleverness and your ingenuity, your love of mystery, what they don't like is that bit of light that makes you, human. Yeah, every Darkling's experience is that the keepers destroy whatever part of them craves quote-unquote light and then replaces it with nothing. Which means that for Darklings that come back, they have to figure out how to adjust to a world where they don't connect with light on either a literal or metaphorical level. They constantly feel insecure and unsafe. They often stalk their families, breaking in during the dead of night to spy on them or just watching from a distance, just avoiding direct confrontation altogether. Their homes are full of bizarre traps and locks, and they're patterned after their hidden heart, which again, the light can never touch. It's so edgy. I love it. Their roles in the Freehold are spies, thieves, and assassins. And yes, the Edge keeps going with the contracts of Shade and Spirit. These are bargains made with death itself. Their powers let them deal with ghosts and let ghosts interact with the mortal world, which is already pretty good. But then it ends with a power that I loved when I first read it and only really came up later in the game line, which is opening the Black Gate. Literally opens a door to the underworld. We get no more information about this because it is not a changeling place, and ghosts have nothing else to do with changelings. So until you got to Geist the Sin Eaters, it was up to you to figure out what does that mean. But you have to admit, it just sounds awesome to do.
The bit about homes makes me think, because it says somewhere in here that they're very protective of their homes, and I'm thinking to myself, is any changeling not protective of their home? But
the fairest are the least protective of them in the sense that they go for the communal ones, but all of them have different takes on it.
Yeah. It also feels like some of these seemings are certainly getting more stereotyped than others, maybe because when there's sort of an obvious alignment between Darklings and the roles in the Freehold of thief, spy, assassin, etc. So, yeah, there's less diversity maybe than you would find with like the beasts. Or perhaps with the next one, the elementals, who we are told are the most diverse seeming. The realms that are listed here are the fiery and metallic City of Brass, the airy and self-explanatory Flying City, and the circuit board-ish shining network of metal and electricity.
Is that what it's supposed to look like? I could not visualize what the shining network looks like.
That's kind of what I assumed, like, or just wire tangled. I don't know. The key thing about the elemental transformation is that it was dramatic and violent, turning them abruptly into forces of nature with rather alien mindsets. Sometimes they approach this as a voluntary, but not really voluntary choice. In particular, the book says they're some of the only ones who chose to enter Arcadia. They have a difficult time relearning how to be mortal, but they like humans who share an appreciation for their element, which I thought was a nice touch. The air elementals hanging out with hang gliders and skydivers and whatnot. They are assumed by freeholds to be eccentric weirdos. Nevertheless, they are good neutral parties to have in debates. They kind of live on the outskirts, but they can be beings of great power. The new contracts we get here are the contracts of communion. These let you, in order, sense element, question it, sense the element distantly, make a servitor out of it, or make an ally out of it, which is basically a more powerful servitor. And I need to just read the paragraph that goes from the end of page 29 onto page 30, because this is the encapsulation of all my frustrations with this book's writing style. So it says, with regards to the elemental, the Fae performed some of these transformations using futuristic devices similar to those used on some of the Wizened. In particular, many of the mannequins were placed in strange machines similar to those used on a few of the Wizened, and some were operated on by small and twisted beings similar to the Graves who tormented many of the Wizened. In these cases, the elementals were often taken apart like the Wizened, but were then reassembled, blah, 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 blah. Editor, please. Just...
I kind of get the feeling that somebody really liked the elementals in this book because they get this stuff like the Wizened get, and they're like the beast, but they get even more diverse. And also, while the beasts lost their minds, the elementals had it worse because they lost their bodies and sometimes their minds. Well, you said that some people intentionally seek out the Fae because the transformative properties here, which gets into a theme of dysmorphia that is part of Changeling, but which they emphasize here. And what I really miss from this section, being trans myself, is I would have loved them to get into the idea of dysmorphia or dysphoria at some point in the line, and I don't think they ever do. So reading the section was frustrating because I'm like, you're so close to saying something topical about this.
Yeah, but for 2007, I mean, one takes what one can get, I guess.
Yes, that is true.
So next up
are the fairest. Their memories of Arcadia include the Shining Metropolis, a decadent Art Deco city full of nobility warring against each other from a distance, then using Ferris for personal entertainment, including squicky stuff. The Garden. This did not really feel like a Ferris place to me. It felt forced. It's a psychotropic botanical garden in which the Ferris are made to stand next to and take care of dangerous plants. It kind of felt like something that you would have given to the Wizen, but it's here, so And the Menagerie Dome, for which honestly, head empty, I had no thoughts. Did you have anything that you thought about regarding the Menagerie Dome?
Not in particular.
Then I'll talk about what it's like to become a Ferris. They best understand the reason for which they were taken as compared to the other seemings. It was always for either beauty or talent with the arts. They undergo relatively minor changes, physically speaking. Their talents grow, but they also feel conflicted about invoking them because it reminds them of Arcadia. And this is a truly tragic thing to imagine that somebody's passion for singing, dancing, writing, drawing could be something which brings them joy and then is tainted by the knowledge that they're only this good because they spent 20 years having to perfect their art to not get eaten by a monster.
Yeah.
Though speaking of eaten, the most dramatic changes are to the Draconic, who get literally vored and rebirthed by the beast. They crack out of an egg, and now they have the beautiful dragon form. Surroundings, they like to collect beautiful things and live with people. They struggle to find the mortal world interesting after enjoying the pleasures of Arcadia. However, they connect with humanity through their art and often by working with or inspiring others. However, sometimes those interactions remind them of their keeper, and they get very upset about that. To put that in a modern context, I could see parasocial relationships being something that Ferris strongly discourage. A sidebar, because the Ferris often have physical beauty as a key characteristic, the books as they often struggle with getting older and losing their attractiveness. I've found this a little bit off for a couple of reasons. Feels like it's a little bit shaming people for getting older, and I think it also misses a chance to say that you could have the opposite problem, that Ferris might find that no matter how old they get, their features remain perfect. They never develop laugh lines or other markers of age, and they find themselves growing a little bit distant from the people around them. A terrible reminder of what they've been through.
Yeah, I liked that they were thinking about it, but maybe different or more thoughts would have been helpful.
For those who do want to restore their youth, there are some rumors of various ways to do it, all of which come with the caveat that you're going to be paying a price for it. For freehold roles, we have dealing with mortal authorities or complex social situations, both for the freehold in general and individual changelings. This is different from the beasts, who also get called upon for handling social situations, but it tends to be more like the friendly, like, hey, have a chat in the bar and something casual kind of vibe. The Ferris also provide financial support for the freehold because, well, they're often the most adept at getting hired for having useful trade skill with their arts or, honestly, just being the pretty people. Finally, their contracts, which I suppose we'll have to elaborate upon when we get to listeners' questions, are the contracts of separation. These literally make the Ferris separated from the world so that she can become practically weightless, convince bullets to avoid her, slip free of shackles, and even become intangible. Love it.
Spoiler, these are my favorites in the entire book.
That's all I have to say about the Ferris. Do you have anything to add before we get into the ogres?
Just that the Draconics always just, it's so weird that they're in here. Like, I get what they're going for, but I don't know. It still has not gelled for me that they are a kith here.
I don't think that's going to get any better when we get to the actual kith section expanding upon it. And I think that's part of maybe why they wanted to expand and break the seeming kith connection in 2E because of that.
Yeah, you know what it is that it's the part that feels most fantasy RPG to me. Like, at variance with most of the rest. Like, oh yes, the dragons are beautiful and terrible and mystical and wise and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, well, but the myths that you're going to, they're often just kind of greedy and vindictive. But anyway, also, I did a control F for the word however in this book. It comes up 87 times, and 6 of those are on page 37. 3 of them are in a single paragraph. Editor pro tip: you should not have the word however 3 times in one paragraph. It's been a public service announcement. Moving on to ogres. These ogres are brought forth by realms such as the Grisly Farm, where laziness is not tolerated, the comparatively benign and barren Hardscrabble home, with a brutally honest keeper who goes around and sometimes recruits travelers who fall into his realm, and the Thornhold, populated by oath breakers. Their abduction often follows from gluttony, rage, and or bitterness, and brutality is what defines their transformation. Invariably, all of them have known violence during their time in Arcadia. Coming back to Earth, the ogres tend to be territorial and settled, preferring simplicity and or defensibility in their homes. They actually integrate surprisingly easily into mortal society given their talents. They make loyal friends and implacable enemies. They may set up their own little kingdoms, much like gangland turf rulers. Obviously, they often get brute work and menial tasks in the freehold, but they also make great allies for the other lost. Their contracts are those of oath and punishment. These allow them to jump, sense oathbreakers, strengthen clarity, locate a target, and punish oathbreaking. So there's some serious troll vibes here. Sometimes those actually feel a little bit out of place to me. Dreaming troll, I should say. Like,
You mean the idea of having the oath and punishment contracts at all for the ogres?
well, the idea of having the strong, seemingly brutish ones be the ones that are most concerned with oaths seems to me like a troll carryover.
I have 2 thoughts which might tie into that. One is that this may have been an authorial callback to dreaming because people want to play their trolls, and
Yes.
giving that to the ogres seems like the most obvious place to put them. The other thing is that there's a note here that the ogres expect honest and fair dealings, and they get angry when they don't get it, and to hell with mortal law. So the idea of an ogre being the one to punish you for not doing things the way they understand it does feel fun. I still agree with you that it is a little weird given their general themes, but Puka, we must appreciate this if for only the fact that Sense Tainted Vow lets you tell if somebody breached the terms of service of a website.
I mean, they must just be overwhelmed whenever they activate that one. This is also, they did have individual kith specific examples. So whoever the writer was for this section, it's like, no. Like it says, a water dwelling one is this, and a gristle grinder is this. And it's just, anyway.
Last tragic note here is that in their freehold roles, it emphasizes that they often wind up being muscle, but it's in part because they often don't complain very much. So a lot of ogres might actually really not like doing muscle work, but the experiences they have in Arcadia make them just kind of roll with it.
I'm just envisioning one like, I'm a cyclopean, but I just want to sing. Shall we talk about the last but not least? Well, actually, they are the least fortunate, according to this. The wizened.
Okay, I think I held this in the core book, but I'm not really a fan of the wizened in first edition's presentation, which we're going to get into here momentarily. First, the memories of Arcadia. You get the Citadel of the Greys, which is pulp sci-fi alien planet vibes. Heck yeah, love it. Mushroom planet, sure. The Mechanical Forest. Again, leaning in kind of a sci-fi vibe, it's a world where everything, literally everything, is made out of metal. And then the Cavern World, which just feels like a repeat of the one from the Beast section.
Yeah.
The big cavern where they're separated into goblin camps, whatever that means. It says here that becoming a wizened means that they're often chosen from outcasts, and that there isn't actually anything special about the Wizen. They're just kind of a general, I don't know, you were picked up because they needed to fill a role or whatever, and you happen to be there or be unfortunate to wander in. The ones that escape, though, so they have a reputation as being like the tinkerers and very clever, but the book says, well, that's only because they're the ones who were clever enough to escape. Which I kind of get, but I don't know. Like they twist this around in the second edition to emphasize that the Wizened really were clever and good at something. But in first edition, they weren't anything special, but they all happen to be really good at artifice after they escape, and often at various tasks. It just feels a little bit off to me. But the book says there is no meaning to their taking. They are tortured and have something taken from them, and then they are given drudge work in which they somehow find purpose. Not really clear how they find purpose in their drudge work. I kind of would have liked more words on that. Again, it feels like the thing with the Wizen just kind of assumes that the Wizen are going to go through this sequence of events and wind up like this, but
in every part-time job, you have to find the thing that grips you and stick to it. That's
my banality increases. Clarity damage. The Wizen prefer to keep the finest examples of whatever they collect. They have a tendency to unconsciously touch objects that are on their person, take very good care of their tools, even if their personal living situation may or may not be a mess. They tend towards obsessive compulsive behavior when stressed, or personifying objects, which sounds kind of creepy but also awesome. They often struggle with social interactions, period, because any kind of social interaction reminds them of interacting with their keeper, who was their primary social interaction for a while. That genuinely hurts to hear. I do feel bad for the Wizen's whole situation.
Isn't it also the case that they're the only ones that are specified to remember like every detail of their time there?
Yes, they have exceptionally good memory of it because the keepers oftentimes did not care enough about them to distract them with other things or mess with them enough for them to forget. So, yeah, they're stuck just remembering. Life is just very painful for the Wizened.
Yeah.
For their interactions with the mortal world, it emphasizes that because they struggle to deal with people, especially in chaotic situations, they often lead regimented lives, including ones where they can isolate, which is probably not good given that they're already naturally inclined towards personifying objects. And I don't think you want to see what happens to a Wizened who is left alone in their home for like a month with no social contact. For freehold roles, they're often valued for their crafting or healing abilities, and also entrusted with the defense of the freehold because, and I actually love this, they are the most fiercely determined to never return. And finally, their contracts of animation enables them to communicate with objects and to request their aid. So if you really like playing around with guns and wrenches and all sorts of other fun tools, these are the set of contracts for you. That's it for them.
Yeah, so it's a pretty solid dive into each of the seemings, I would say. I don't know, they were all fine, but I think my favorite might have actually been the Darklings, just because I feel like I got a better sense of them than I had before. But, I mean, all of them I thought were rich. I mean, to your point about entitlements for the different seemings, I wouldn't have minded seeing one or more unique merits for each, or, like I said before, more about their opinions of and interactions with each other. If the writing were a little bit less equivocal, that would have also helped ground things more. Because like with all those howevers, there was such a many of this seeming are this, but many are also this opposite thing. And it just felt like it was undercutting itself too much to me.
I was overall impressed with this chapter. Before they would have written this, I wouldn't have known what you would have really said about the seemings to fill up a few dozen pages, but while they could have been shorter on some points and added in some of those elements that you brought up, I think that it is a worthy addition for anybody who is not fully vibing with their seemings or just looking for additional inspiration for their character.
Mm-hmm. One other thing that I'll say is the contracts here really help me see the advantage of breaking them out of the 1 to 5 system, as they did in 2nd edition, because the progressions and sometimes the costs, like for what you get, feel a little out of place or out of order. I mean, having that gun shoot itself is great, but spending 2 glamour to do it once at level 4 is like, that's a lot. That's a lot of work for just a one-off thing. So after all of that, we get this even shorter little vignette about 2 changelings waiting for the parents of one of them to come home, since apparently they willingly gave up their child to the capital F Fae. Yee.
I did not get what that story was about, so thank you for explaining.
Yeah, it's actually a really great antagonist that I don't think we saw in Autumn Nightmares, did we? Like, there's a story waiting to be told.
How do you mean?
Well, like, you've got mortal antagonists of various stripes, but how about your own parents who sold you to the Fae? Like,
the parents sold them to the... Oh, that's good. Oh, I love that.
The postscript to Rumpelstiltskin or whatever.
Oh, that's so good.
So this brings us into Chapter 2, 100 Cousins, or kiths. And we start with a description of what kith signifies. So I have, if you'll permit me to get academic for a second here, I have a theory of a kith in Lost versus Dreaming. The key things that stand out to me from the description here. So first, in Lost, kiths are post hoc attempts to lump similar unique changes together rather than a root dream that can be expressed in different ways, as it is in Dreaming. Because in Dreaming, I will argue that kiths do allow as much variety if you put your mind to it. So, distinction 1. And then second, kith in Lost is more of an external label for external changes that happened externally. They may shape you psychologically as well, but they were applied from the outside by the Fae, rather than internal identities that lead to changes from the inside. Although certainly a lost changeling, if you have some kind of changes that have been applied to you, you may internalize them, and that informs the identity that you have. This book actually makes me think they don't want that to be the default with their language about like different kiths aligning across seemings. So it seems like the kith should be something you don't identify with as strongly, but I'm still wrestling with that.
I wanted to ask your thought about the distinction in variety, because certainly I've had the thought, and I think you and Josh have mentioned this before, that a lot of people complain that it seems like within the kith there is not a lot of variety in Dreaming. And I can kind of see that when I mentally compare what a freehold party with either one looks like. Like, I just imagine there being a greater diversity in supernatural appearances that you would get at a party in a Lost Freehold versus one in a Dreaming Freehold. And I'm not sure whether that's a consequence of the art in Dreaming, or if that's actually genuinely the direction that the designers were going with at the time.
Frankly, I think it's because of the art. And I don't think there's anything in Dreaming that stops you from describing your redcap or your slua or your boggin in a way that suits the character you envision. There are certain traits which are carried forward, like slua tend to be kind of, I don't know, awkwardly jointed and lithe, and boggins tend to be short, and redcaps tend to not have noses, or like whatever. But it's rarely spelled out in any way within the books, and it often changes from book to book. So yeah, I don't know. I kind of feel like when people, this is me getting salty for a second, when people make complaints about Dreaming in that way, it's like, well, the books don't say that you can have it look however you want. And I'm like, well, then that's a failure of your imagination. Anyway, the other thing with kiths and Lost too is that they are optional rather than inherent. They can be taken on and off. So they are primary identifiers for a changeling, but they are one among many of a diverse set of identifiers. So kith and seeming and court and entitlement, like all of that. Whereas in Dreaming, I would say that kiths are the primary identifiers for each character.
In fact, in Lost, while seeming and court may be the primary identifiers, typically, it's also important to note, as they emphasize in this section, that the Lost don't truly have a primary identifier, which, I don't know, maybe actually fits the whole idea of them being lost. That sometimes you have these ad hoc comparisons where they say, this group of changelings over here are angels, these ones are kitsune. Those are equally valid within the fiction, because they're trying to find a place for themselves, something that they fit into.
Yeah. And I don't think one system or the other, comparing Lost and Dreaming, is better. They tell similar stories from different and sometimes opposite perspectives in terms of how people are lumped together or choose to come together, in terms of what the basis for those comparisons and alignments are. And there are also parts that are unifying. So, like, in both cases, there's an element of family with all that can entail. And in this section, it kind of spells out, it says, as the name implies, kith means family. And some of us don't get along with everybody in our family. Wherever that may lie relative to a changeling seeming in the aspect of like the trauma bonded found family, it seems like they want seeming and kith to generate different valences of this person gets me in order to fulfill different stories. But this also compounds my frustration for the writing style with the organization of information around this topic, because it's spelled out slightly differently in a half dozen places rather than being all kind of unified into a single section. So this is me trying to like glean pieces together.
It doesn't help that, to counter what we both like, it says the kith names are in common usage, even if only by hobgoblins, who will just pick up on what your kith is and go, oh yeah, you're clearly a dancer. It's like, well, then what's the point of this?
Right, yeah. And it raises questions like, what if you are a good dancer who is not a capital D dancer? Like, there are these blurry lines, which, if you're saying that these labels are primarily externally applied and that each individual changeling doesn't feel that much affiliation with them.
I think this is the time to say that in Lost, one of the fun things you can do is that your character can identify as a puka or a redcap. They can say, that's what my legend and myth seems to resonate with. That's what I'm going to call myself. And then they have to prove that. This, by the way, is not me making a dig against Dreaming. I just think it's interesting that changelings in Lost can choose to identify with a myth in that fashion. Though there may be some issues with that I don't think the book really gets into, that we'll probably have to talk about at some point between now and chapter 3.
Briefly, let me just say on the side here, there are suggestions for telling stories about growing into a kith from being kithless, which I really like, although there has to be kind of a narrative reason for doing that. Don't just go for cool powers. Think about what is the psychological advantage of identifying with others that have been reshaped similarly to you, because that's what we're talking about here. Often it involves a hedge-based quest as well. But then in the section that follows on designing new kiths, which the C20 toolkit kind of echoed later, really it's how to design a blessing, not really a kith. But there's a note on page 60 where it says, a rationale for a new kith is easy enough to come by. It's just another variation that might not have yet been seen. A new kith is almost never actually new, after all. So it's one of the key differences from Dreaming, I think, where each kith is not just a variation on a theme from the seeming, but is a fully formed inheritance. And like I've said before, I don't know that one is better than the other, but it is a different approach to the significance of what a kith is. One vector of incorporating some ideas from Dreaming into Lost, using it with caution, is to connect this with like the inherited trauma piece. That idea of, by being a kith, you are inheriting something. And in the context of Lost, what you're inheriting is a similarity of the Durance, essentially.
I think there's something to be said for that, because one thing which maybe the books kind of miss an opportunity for is that they talk about how durances under a single keeper can leave similar marks upon people in various ways. But those then tend to boil down to the idea of kiths, and I don't think that there's a good opportunity here where they could have said, piggybacking off what you said, to have it that there are famous kiths in Lost, and they're famous because everybody knows that if you're that kith, then that means that you probably came from this keeper or this part of Arcadia. And that kith has a lot of stories behind it that, for better or worse, you are stuck with.
And that's the kind of thing which there could have been more room to do if they stopped repeating their sentences in different phrasings.
It would have also given more value to the riddle kith contract, which is the one where you can look like a different kith, which is kind of okay, but if they actually had that kind of narrative difference, would have been a really big deal.
Yeah, and I mean, to the point about that contract, it's like, if kith doesn't matter that much, like why would a changeling care to be identified by their kith? It's not as though there's kith-specific prejudices that we see here very deeply. It's not like there are kiths that resemble each other, so that kind of confounds it a little bit. Maybe it was just that dreaming design was intruding on lost design. I don't know. But I'll give this to the opening section of this chapter. It certainly got me thinking about the significance of kith in the context of the game, which I think deserves probably more thought than the section allowed for. But anyway.
Last couple notes before getting to the kith list is that if you are designing a new kith, they recommend that you aim to be broad. For example, choosing a kith around the concept of metal, not copper, unless you're looking to represent a very specific fey creature for which there is advice in Chapter 3. And that secondarily, that their blessing shouldn't be as broad or body-altering as a contract unless it has a major drawback.
Yeah.
And then the kith list. Take it away.
So the kiths proper are divided up by seeming. Each section starts with a kith list and then moves through the kiths from the core book. Each of those has psychological and physical distinctions that constitute their kith, then information about their durance and how they might have escaped, some worldwide folklore connections, and a few sample frailty ideas. It's a good structure overall and definitely enriches the rather spare descriptions in the core book. I think the psychological aspects and nature of durance are probably the most useful for getting into character headspace, but I loved the sample frailties because they were nicely flavorful. Folklore I'm going to save for chapter 3. And then after all of that, at the end of each section for the seemings are some new kiths, which have spare descriptions like the core book ones. At first I was like, but you just showed me how to do a more involved kith write-up. But it's okay, because now having that model, I can imagine the more fleshed out versions for myself. It is a bit harder, I would say, to see folklore connections for some of the new ones, but yeah. So for the beasts, we get nice notes about how the kith lists are kind of chimeric with undefinable animal features.
Oh, that was unsettling.
Yeah. I'd most likely want to play a steep scrambler or a windwing, but I think that the skitterskulks probably benefit the most from the enriched description that they get here. It really fleshes out why and how one might play them. I do raise an eyebrow. There's one point where they refer, I think in the Runner Swifts, they refer to cheetahs as being game animals, and I'm like, I don't think they quite count as that.
While we'll talk more about folklore in detail later on, I do want to emphasize that steep scramblers are an example of one where I think the folklore gets weird. Like, well, they're good at climbing, and the steep scramblers, think of whimsical yet dangerous monkey gods such as Hanuman and Sun Wukong. Monkeys are tricksters and lore more in a lot of cultures. Like,
pick a lane.
Okay, I don't think that's like a key trait of Sun Wukong that I'm familiar with. Really good at climbing. More of a jumper, I think.
Well, the thing with animal folklore is that you can really find basically any combination of animal and demeanor you want, which to me just reinforces the idea of kith being this very surface level trait.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. But then the new ones we have are the clear eyes with their exceptional senses, the reptilian cold scales, the carrion-eating rot eaters, and the loyal true friends, the very best doggos. I think I liked the clear eyes best here, but
clear eyes have a fantastic benefit. Look, being able to have animal senses to see or hear from a mile away, stuff like that is just fantastic.
Yeah, you can do like the Wolverine thing. So then the Darklings, all right, they were committed to having each of these be exactly 6 pages, and they decided to play with font size to make it fit into that. Because suddenly the font size goes up 2 notches.
I did not notice that. I didn't notice how edgy the Darklings symbol is. A little bat wing around something that looks vaguely insectile. I love it.
It's basically Curseborn, but a bat or something. I really don't know what to do with the kithless right up here. It's like, they're fragments of darkness. All right. There's fewer kiths to get through, so fewer words overall. I'm all in on mirror skins. That's probably the one that I think is the most engaging here. Though, like the skitterskulks, the tunnel grubs also benefit from having richer description here. New ones are the aerial lurk gliders, the lunatic moonborn, the eerie musician night singers, the shadowy pale wraiths, the self-explanatory razor hands, and the whisper wisps who spy and whatnot.
Here I must note the razor hand has a picture of a man who has razors for hands, who is also carrying an actual razor in his hand.
And has like a Jim Carrey and the Mask vibe going on.
Yes! Yes! The book says it's a huge benefit. They get a +1 lethal damage. I'm like, I don't think it's that great. But, sure, they're razor hands. Why not?
Well, and they point out, like, oh, well, they also get the specialty in knives, because you might argue, oh, it's just the same as carrying a knife. Okay. I think my favorite is the Night Singers, because I really want to make a cricket-themed one. Next up are the elementals.
Yay.
There's a note that the kithless elementals are rare, which makes sense, because I would say, like beasts, they're maybe the most defined by their kith, as opposed to the seeming as a whole. They largely align with inanime phyla. I mean, most of these correspond to different groups of inanime. And to that end, I would say the mannequins benefit the most from the write-up here. One of the classic questions when it comes to inanime and the dreaming is, why are the mannequins part of the inanime? So I think you could port a lot of this back into dreaming to answer that question, although I am still pro Fireheart. The notes on durance throughout this are all really useful, because each of them has their individual way that a player has to approach the mentality of being a force of nature. By contrast, the folklore connections are a little bit thinner on the ground, maybe with somewhat less variation than you get in other seemings. But I think I'm fine with that.
Do you have any favorite frailties yet from the things that have come up?
I love all of them, frankly. Some of them are maybe more clearly taken from specific stories than others. Some of them maybe fit stereotypes of the kiths more closely, but I think they're all great, honestly.
Notice, by the way, that because the way some of them are phrased, that they wouldn't work neatly with the actual frailty system. For example, the Woodblood have helpless at the stroke of noon. You're just going to have to adjudicate what that means. But it's cool.
While those 12 chimes are happening, you can't do anything. New ones are the pollution-born Blightbent, the electric Levenquick, the self-explanatory Metal Flesh, and the desert-shaped Sand Harrowed. I like Colossus from the X-Men, so the Metal Flesh is cool, but the pollution-born Blightbent, I think, are the most interesting of these.
Finally, we can have our antagonists for the Captain Planet Changeling game.
So the font size went down for the elementals, and now it goes back up again as we turn to the fairest. They have a higher incidence of kithless than most, as they are just perfected overall, rather than in a specific direction. I thought the association of the flowering with meanings from the languages of flowers was probably the coolest piece in here. I was hoping for more justification of why the Draconic are in the fairest. I did not get it.
I didn't get it either. Okay, great. We're on the same page about that.
Literally the same page. New kiths here include the entrancing flame sirens, the rainbow-hued polychromatics, bonus points from me for having their little mood ring emotion shifting power thing. The Shadow Soul, antitheses of Bright Ones, celestial-themed Tellurics, and the purely decorative Treasured. I actually liked all of these, I think.
They're fun. The Shadow Soul is so good. If you ever said, God, I want to be beautiful, but I really want to feel more like Evanescence than anything else.
Well, it reminds me of like the Galadriel. Maybe that's a mashup of Bright One and Shadow Soul with the treacherous as the sea and all of that. I also really like the idea of the Tellurics. I just don't know what kind of durance that would look like. So overall, the fairest kiths, though, they feel quite hard to make them feel distinct from each other. They are variations on a theme. And in the same way that elementals are aligned with beasts and being more identifiable with their kiths, I would say fairest, darklings, and ogres are all kind of just expressions of the same idea in some way.
To address your question, I think a Telluric would have either been in charge of making sure that the stars are right in that part of Arcadia, or they would have been trusted with the maddening task of keeping perfect track of time in all senses for their keeper.
Oh, I like that.
And good luck.
Then we get to ogres. Oh, hey, the kithless section here agrees with the statement I just made. Nice. So yeah, the kithless are just kind of expressions of their their central core idea of being large, intimidating, and grotesque. They have extensive notes about the Cyclopean smelling powers, which adds a lot of richness to that kith. But I think my favorite write-up here was for the water dwellers. It does a good job of making them distinct from the waterborne and plays into some really good mythic tropes. Certainly did a better job distinguishing the stone bones from the earth bones. Like, that I was still wrestling with. New ones are the blood brutes, made to fight, the necrophagic corpse grinders, the destructive renders, and the witch tooth that embody classic hag myths.
I love that we get the witch tooth because, like, she's not big and spooky looking, which is important.
She is an actual legit nun.
She looks so
Well,
cool.
I shouldn't make assumptions. She could just be in a nun outfit. That is my favorite of the new ones, but they honestly feel a little bit redundant. And like, I mean, ogres are probably my least favorite seeming. They just don't stoke my imagination much. But yeah. The font then gets even smaller as we move into the wizened. This is what happens when you have to do 8 deep kith dives in 6 pages. Like, the font just gets real tiny. There's an interesting note that the kithless among them may have escaped because they weren't tailored to a specific role in the Fey realm. There are other interesting notes, like how the Chatelans come closest to having a keeper's trust.
I've always loved the Chatelans. It's so unsettling that even after they leave Arcadia, that they keep this aspect of, well, of course, you know, service is built into me. It's like, oh, that's unsettling.
Another one that stood out to me was the Oracles as being exceptional because they didn't fulfill a role. It's like the true Fate don't need changelings to see through fate. They just kind of gained their changes from being experimental subjects or some other reason from being in Arcadia.
I miss that. That's terrifying. I also find it tragic that one of their kiths is the soldier, which
right.
because of their wise indicates how disposable they are.
Yeah. New ones are the wordsy authors, the laboring drudges, the crafty game players, and the stalwart miners, all of which are pretty self-explanatory. I don't really understand why we needed to have a gambling system sidebar, but sure.
Well, we have that rule for the game players, so I guess they really felt like it was important that we add this in, but it does seem like a bit much, especially because they gave them a piece of art to go with it.
Yeah. Well, I think that was just like that would have been with the other 3 on the previous page. They just bumped it over there.
Okay.
And then we close with 2 pages of optional kith rules. So you can get a dual kith, which is really just an extra blessing. But again, not just for its own sake. Get a story justification first. And you can get that either as a 3-point merit or narratively as your weird increases. It is a nice note that the dual kith can be interpreted as a single kith as well, and that you can fuse the 2 blessings into something appropriate for the character. This is something which I always want to do in games, and then the game and or the ST will never let me. So I'm glad that there's an option for that here.
I love that idea too. I think it's a great way to show your character changing over time and getting cooler new benefits.
Similarly, the notes on shedding a kith as the converse of gaining one, I really love that. Particularly if you explore it as the idea of overcoming those scars from Arcadia. So that's a neat thing, I think.
But I gotta ask you, what do you think about this wild idea of disassociating kith and seeming? I can't see that ever happening, really, but...
Well, I mean, that's 2E for you. But I think 2E gets away with it because the kiths there are much more like the wizened and that they're task-themed. And having it here in 1st edition, again, makes the idea of a kith feel even shallower to me. It's like, well, what's the point of them? You know, it's like you might as well have all the blessings just be merits and say, pick what you want. But anyway. So yeah, with that last bit of the chapter especially, I feel like the mission statement, maybe of the book as a whole, is, hey player, maybe you thought that a certain seeming or a kith was pointed towards this role or that role. But guess what? Anyone can be anything. Which, from a certain perspective, that's great. No matter what your trauma, you aren't held back from being whatever you want to be. But it feels much harder to build a character identity around a splat that is so surface level. I think that is intentional, like taking the individual trauma and the deep psychological work that this game prompts and linking it with somewhat shallow associations with particular folklore tropes and tales. I see that as sort of a commentary on trauma does not define me. So maybe you don't want your kith, or your seeming for that matter, to be your entire identity. That being said, I do think players can grab onto that more easily than some of the other pieces. And so having the enriched descriptions really helps with that. And some of the new ones are fun. Like, I envision having fun playing a telluric or a polychromatic or whatnot, or a night singer.
Yeah, like with Seemings, for anyone who wanted to get more out of a kith, who felt like that it was underbaked, but they really wanted it to be important for their character, taking any of these and using them for inspiration can be a great way of solidifying that. And I might have a little more to say about that, but that involves us getting to chapter 3.
Yes, with this amazing Melissa Uran art piece to start us off. And it illustrates this short vignette about some Vietnamese fae pulling one over on a visitor by feeding him a cobra heart that reanimates inside him or something. Beautiful. And then, oh my god, this font is so tiny. Pro tip, if you have a set page count that you're working with, plan your sections better. Anyway. So chapter 3, 1,000 Courts. This is kind of a catch-all chapter that moves through different aspects of the game. But the goal is to demonstrate the variety found worldwide, right? Like, that was what was laid out in the introduction. I apologize in advance. I'm going to have to give a little bit of a TED talk here. With the very overt decoupling of seeming and kith from specific mythologies in the core book, in the context of our interview with Pete, where he said, oh, you can make something that resembles a puka or another figure from lore, but it isn't the same as that thing, I struggle to determine whether what this chapter lays out goes directly against that or not. Lost often feels like it wants to suggest a chicken and egg approach. Did the lore inspire the Fae or vice versa? But although some capital F Fae do inspire lore, which you see with more recent bits like alien abductions, it seems like ultimately the gentry adopt shapes and characteristics from lore. However, and this is a big however, they mix and match and remix because they don't have the cultural context or human perspective on those legends. And so this is kind of a metagame issue. Like, what does it mean for a being from folklore to be recast as a keeper and possibly mashed up with other beings? It could set a precedent that any folkloric being of note is an unknowable and untrustworthy kidnapper, which is tricky territory around appropriation and stuff. I will also point out that, for example, the W word that's been removed from werewolf is in here. So, like, that sensitivity was not always present, possibly, in this book. And if you instead choose to recast those beings as changelings, then fundamentally you're saying those are traumatized former humans, which is also not necessarily the most sensitive and nuanced way to bring these in. It's not that dreaming is better about how it handles other cultures' legends, but the framework that they get shoehorned into is more about the setting of glamour, banality, and the dreaming, and less about their fundamental inhumanity. So that kind of dug at me a little. It may be that I just have not much faith in tables doing their due diligence, but I feel like any commentary you can make in-game or out of game about the extra layers of Fey alienness in this regard, with refashioning the sacred and the mysterious because they just don't get it, that would be lost in the service of making an antagonist recognizable to players. There's a sidebar on page 104 that is like, go Google things, find books. And it doesn't encourage me because it just suggests that without a process of self-interrogation or thinking about appropriateness or resisting the urge to cherry pick the bits that serve your game while leaving out the rest. Maybe it was good for 2007. They seemed so excited to use the internet to go beyond the Eurocentric stuff, but they didn't pause for a second to kind of like really frame it, I think. Anyway, that's my that's my thought dump.
I actually want you to talk a little bit more about that within the context of my understanding of what this chapter was going on about, which was a little bit different. So I'm actually expecting a little bit of pushback here.
Mm-hmm.
In the core book, they presented the true Fae as being enigmatic. Nobody knows what they are. Changelings have theories, but they're at best educated guesses and more likely just what the changelings say to make themselves feel like they're more in control. In Autumn Nightmares, they give a nod to like a dozen different things they could be, most of which are kind of the same thing. Maybe they're angels and demons from Christian mythology. Maybe they're the middle. But anyway, this book in chapter 3 emphasizes the idea that no, the true Fae are very specifically creatures that are made out of human dreams. And like you say, they remix them. What I got from it talking about how the true Fae can represent real-world mythological figures and how the changelings can represent real-world mythological figures came from the idea that some true fae bear enough of a resemblance to whatever dreams they were taken from that people take them to be that. There's a big section here about how some true fae settle down in a region. They basically absorb the myths of that region, and then they remix that into their own world. They take people there, and then those people wind up being part of that remix, which then leads to things like, oh, the Chimera are local to this area because they're taken by a true fae who in turn was basing themselves off of a local myth. And the changelings themselves, also not having direct answers, may sometimes look toward local myth to give themselves some answers. So it's not to say that they're trying to say that, hey, no, the true fae are actually the gods and spirits of various real-world faiths, nor are the changelings them. Rather, in both cases, the characters themselves are either appropriating, particularly in the case of the true fae, because they can't really create, or with the changelings that they're trying to contextualize through a lens that is familiar to the area that they're from.
Unrelated, just as a complete aside, the little section says 1,000 gentry. There's something deleted here, right? Or am I missing something? Where it's like, okay, so what follows isn't exactly 1,000 new gentry, but you will find a handful of fair folk briefly described. These keepers are meant to embody the folktales and mythologies of various cultures.
I don't think we got any. Yeah,
no. Anyway. But yeah, no, I think my concern is more to do with outside of the game and planning rather than the justifications within the setting, for sure. Like, on page 105, there's a bit where they tacitly warn players about pillaging folklore. Their word, it says, oh, so you choose to pillage folklore to create a character in perhaps the same way the fair folk do. And I'm thinking, like, that's not a good thing. You know? The keepers are allowed to do that within the context of the setting for all those things that you just laid out. But I feel like it needs more framing around that. It's very telling to me that they called out Campbell in the little sidebar on Finding Folktales, because that's a very academic, it almost treats mythology aspects as this remixable buffet that you can draw from as you will, despite the fact that the section following is called Why Myth Matters. It's like they actually didn't cover all of the reasons why myth matters. So it's a very sort of psychological take that I think overlooks the particularities of different cultures and the pride people take in them. And I think without addressing that head on, it facilitates tables running wild in the China shop. So you get surface level ideas of what kiths signify, leading to surface level research to inspire new creations. And I don't know that I really have a point to all this, except to reiterate what I think I've said about dreaming. Do your homework carefully. Think about whether you need to draw from a particular folklore to achieve the story or figure that you want. And given the game's open-endedness, lean towards inspiration rather than directly borrowing or appropriation. Like, there are examples given here which focus on tropes, or, as they put it, capturing the spirit of a tale rather than embodying the tale line for line, and pulling out the pieces that line up with the kiths. But I think that you can do that with the themes and archetypes within a story and not kind of try and slot them into any kind of universalizing framework. You can do that without like saying, oh, this is my jackal character from the Tuareg story. Like, that's the example they use here. I worry that players reduce the sort of richness of those story elements into character beats without realizing what they're doing. And this is for PCs. I think like for NPCs, you can get away with it more easily. You can say, this is the background of this NPC, because you're not digging into like the deeper meaning or psychology of what role-playing that changeling will mean. You don't have to interrogate it as deeply, maybe.
Something that would be helpful for players doing this is to look at it out of character with the idea that they need to, out of character, be aware of how much their character might be appropriating something, whether or not their character is doing it. Like, if some character insists that they are Metatron, you need to realize what you're doing by saying that you have a character who thinks that they are Metatron and the kind of reaction that would get, and maybe also what that's saying about the real world. My own Changing the Lost campaign is set in Phoenix, Arizona, but the regional keeper for that area, who has been there for as long as anybody can tell, they're all about isekai. They started with things like Alice in Wonderland, and then John Carter Goes to Mars novels and other pulp sci-fi stories. And then the modern day, they just started looking at Americans, especially, taking isekai anime tropes, and they're just like, oh, this is great. And they've just built their entire world around that. And because of that, most of the changelings in the local freehold, they are stuck with having isekai tropes forced upon them that are already taking from a true fae that is missing the context that they were being taken from in the first place. But the changelings themselves can't help the fact that they all look like either incredibly pretty or horrifically monstrous, or their durances fit in perfectly with wish fulfillment fantasies, whether they were the protagonist or the side character or some generic dungeon master. And a significant portion of the game is about how do they build a society while knowing that they cannot cleanly separate themselves from these appropriative tropes that were thrust upon them in the first place.
Yeah, all good points. I don't want to drag us down too much into like to folklore or not to folklore here, but I think the takeaway that I want to encourage people to do is like, don't just riff on the cool tales that you find, make sure you are handling them appropriately. And I don't just mean like in a cultural sensitivity way. I mean like, think about what it is about that tale which informs the character you want to play and what you actually need, and whether or not it has to rely on some particular expression of that story. And this is an ongoing issue in the study of folklore. There's like the Arne Thompson classification system and whether or not that's actually a useful thing and all of that. But as to whether or not a particular inspiring story can be slotted into existing kiths, if not, we get a bunch more here. Again, there's this sidebar on 107 about mixing and matching aspects of existing kiths to better fit the myth you want to build a character around. I don't think we need to actually get into all the details, but beasts get the stitched together chimera, the trickster coyote, the river predator nix. Darklings get the troglodytic eels, the oddly tongue-focused pishacha, and the feral and leafy skolgsra. Elementals get the graceful misty apsaras, the misleading asquidaid, and the calming jeweled ditsang. Fairest get the strange and graceful gandharvas, the corruptive incubi and succubi, and the matronly Weissefrau. Ogres get rebellious daityas, vicious oni who punish sinners, and the classic Nordic trolls. And the wizened get malevolent gremlins, the salacious Pamarindo, and the hypnotic Tusa fiddlers. So most of these are still of Indo-European origin, I will point out. But even more than the other new kiths that we saw in the last chapter, I find it hard to see how to develop these really richly and distinctively. This is maybe a key example to me of the don't make it try to be dreaming when it doesn't want to mentality with Lost, because entire kiths here aren't deeply tied to cultures and what they signify. And the efforts to do so are lacking something, maybe that three-dimensionality that you get when you dig beneath the surface into the tales, that cultural background and everything.
I'm not sure they even say which cultures each one are associated with. Like, they mention coyote, and they give a lot of interesting stuff about what the coyote is about, but they don't just say in here, like, where does the coyote myth come from?
They say old America, whatever that means.
Of course, in the folktales of old America. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, the one, so under the elementals, you have the Abenaki figure of the Asquidaid, which is like a will-o'-the-wisp type creature formed of fickle fire. And out of curiosity, I just Googled it, and it's like, oh, there's a Wikipedia page. And it's just a 2-sentence Wikipedia page, and the source for it is the Edge of Darkness wiki. So
maybe not the most reliable.
No.
I see what you're saying, though, that if your goal was, I want to set a game in an area where, the coyote myth is popular. I want to play coyote, but there's not something that represents that. Is there something that I could do to have something that really leans into that myth, because I really want to go heavy on myth? And cool, here you go. It's good for that. But if you're looking for inspiration on how to build an entire culture around these, you're not going to really find that here.
Yeah, and I think that points to what I was trying to say with these are probably better for NPCs, especially one-off NPCs, because you don't need to get quite as deep to introduce them into that kind of chronicle. That's probably the most fraught part of the book for me. Anything else to say before we move on to a much chiller series of Grudge?
Well, just that they aren't anything particularly stronger or weaker mechanically than any of the other kiths that I've seen from the rest of the book. And that succubi, incubi, they didn't include those in the core book. Missed opportunity.
Yep. My favorite are probably the Apsaras, just because I really like the classical Khmer dance tradition around them. Really cool stuff.
Or they talk about thorns by any other name?
Yeah, so just hedge expressions, really. They talk here about what the hedge can look like in non-thorny and non-overgrown parts of Earth, though it doesn't always correspond exactly to the expected terrain in which you find that portal. Overall, each terrain that they go through here is a more intensified, labyrinthine, and often psychedelic or nightmarish version of itself. Each of these we get descriptive notes and a sample goblin fruit, oddment, or trifle one might find there. I have one-liners if I can race through these.
Oh, please do, then.
All right, racing through. Bogs and swamps form the capital M mire, where one can find the Haggai reed, a lockpick oddment. From various deserts where you can get lost and encounter deceptive mirages arises the Judas yew, which has goblin berries that let you go without food or drink. In farmland corn mazes or pumpkin patches grow the head gourds that produce a foul odor, which you can use to increase your defense. Forests seem kind of redundant. Like, it's pretty obvious that you would find hedge portals in a forest, but sure, some trees there secrete verm sap, a sap that attracts vermin. Go figure. Cities are probably my favorite because I've been in many parts of cities that totally break geography or have weird architecture. In some cases, they are overgrown with like weeds and things intruding.
That was maybe the most important one for me for them to include, because you're most often going to be opening hedge portals in a city.
Precisely, yeah. You can find babblegum there, which is a goblin fruit that looks like used chewing gum, but grants you oral omnilingualism for a period of time.
But you can't read anything, if I recall correctly.
Right, yeah. In grasslands, you have surprisingly tall and sharp grass that can get you into the hedge, where you might find the intoxicating choo-choo culm. Jungles also seems like a pretty obvious connection. Here grows the hallucinogenic cousin's trumpet flower. The deep and icy passes or dank caves of mountainous terrains can contain horflake trifles that allow for flight. And if you are in the middle of the ocean, a ship door perhaps can lead you to a supping marine hedge with the mental buffing bottle voice trifle.
I thought it was cheating that the seas and oceans just deposits you back on some form of land.
Yes, I would like to put in a plug for the Sargasso Sea as a naturally occurring sea hedge gate, which is just like this big maze of seaweed near the Bahamas. It's a really cool natural phenomenon. Go look it up. It is full of legends from sailors about like getting lost, so perfect material. And then lastly, in the tundra, where you have other forms of mirages and snow blindness that suggest mazes and whatnot, you can enter the hedge and find the healing pedicle velvet material. There's also this random note about hedge weather, which is obviously changeable and is basically just the Firkless from Dreaming.
I really liked the desert and especially the tundra, because before coming to Thailand, I just lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and I mean, we do have like biomes of like mountains and trees around, but most of it is just like hard rock desert, not sand, just lots of like scrub bush, cacti, and palm trees. It doesn't conform nicely to the image of what you would expect a place to be where you could get into the hedge. So it's great that, particularly with the tundra, they say, yeah, man, it's cold and you can't find a path because it all just kind of looks the fucking same. You're just in a big open, wide terrain. Good luck finding a route through that one. And if you do, you should really stay on it.
I mean, as an urban poker, it's the cities that I vibed most with. But I also liked the notes about the mazes of jungles being three-dimensional and with the farmland, the sort of overall creepiness before you even cross over. Like, they have the note about, oh, a vegetable patch watered with blood. But, like, that's on Earth that they're talking about before you even cross into the hedge. So maybe it was like a battlefield, but I like the idea of what farmer is watering their crops with blood. That's like an interesting thing. There is this repeated note about, oh, crossing over in this terrain is all too easy. Like, okay, yeah, it's as easy as your story needs it to be. Anyway, we then move on to talking about different structures of freeholds.
I don't think a lot of these work for.
Yeah. This is, I mean, I feel like a lot of this book was born out of criticisms of Dreaming being too Eurocentric, and they were really trying to break out of that, but it doesn't always hold up. Like, they even say flat out, oh, the base freehold is a mix of European tradition and Western modernity, but a lost community can be founded on any expression of politics or philosophy. And then they're like, here's how to do a caste system. Like,
Yes, which, in addition to being problematic in general, also runs into a big problem with how lost society works that I'm actually going to say for the dominance one. The ones we get are caste, commune, dominance, nomadic, and territorial. With caste, you have changelings separating themselves into arbitrary divisions based on things like seemings or what the freeholders believe a seeming's purpose to be. A South Korean freehold sees everybody as an outcast, it says, which has local cultural context, and then still divides them into scholars, warriors, tricksters, and the grotesques, which are at the bottom of that.
Even more outcast.
The commune, courts are outlawed, and everyone shares one property from which they work and benefit. Courts are outlawed does not seem like it's going to function as a freehold setup, because the point of the courts is they give you a structure, and if you don't replace it with dominance, slavery, class-based systems that may even use slavery. Their example is a cocaine plantation that has a ruling class of drug lords, but also has enchanted mortals and commoner changelings put to work in the fields. And just the idea of a freehold that's using slavery is so antithetical to this that it's hurting me to think about both their caste and their dominance one in a game setting where changelings really, really do not like being held down to things like this. Nomads, okay, I kind of like the idea of the nomads. They travel either as a matter of course or to avoid the current hunting grounds of the Fae. I'd be curious to know more about that. For fun or to stay off the grid. The Tinkers are a group of travelers that say they can fix anything from cars to madness. And finally, territorial, which I kind of think is just part of the way it works in the core book anyway. Changelings that carve up territory, a city into game territories or fiefdoms. Okay, I did not really care for most of these. What did you think?
I mean, I dig the idea they're going for, but there's just not enough description and it feels like they're reaching. I think I'd be most likely to use the commune or nomadic in a game. There is an interesting note at the start here about how, because the fair folk adhere to this hollow version of medieval society, when changelings give actual substance to it on Earth and create true community with their courts, that confounds the gentry. So it's an interesting idea, and with commune and nomadic in particular, I think it says like both of them, they're just mostly courtless. I like the idea of changelings in those contexts developing their own kinds of court systems, similar to like what we're going to see in a few pages. That idea of the lost naturally gravitate towards this self-organizing principle because they know that that will throw off the keepers. But yeah, the dominance one, I was like, what? And agreed with you that territorial just seems, isn't that just changelings? Next up, we have some brief notes on pledges. They just kind of lay out a few examples from lore and mention that changelings from different parts of the world might swear on names or objects or concepts relevant to their culture. whether drawn from myth or human experience. Makes sense.
Sure.
The examples we get are Forgiveness of the Imp, drawn from the story of Genta and the Kappa for peace, the Fulger's Call, drawing on Icelandic myth to have a changeling protect a human, and the Secrets of the Dead River, invoking the river Styx to keep a secret. I guess these function well as object lessons for showing pledges from other lores, but like the pledge system is so complicated that throwing this in randomly, I'm like, okay, let me go back to the core book and hunt down what this means, how this fits into what we've already seen. Like, it feels like a throwaway piece that they tossed in.
Yeah, I didn't really have a lot to say about the old pledges. You've covered pretty much everything. I'm excited to talk about the faraway courts.
All right, so the courts.
Yeah, we get the introduction to the idea of the faraway courts, which begins with the idea that the seasonal courts are a good concept, but that they don't apply equally well to all places in the world, given that not every place has the same concept of seasons. As somebody who has lived in Phoenix, Arizona, where it's just hot year-round, except for maybe monsoon season, and our kind of cold season, and Thailand, where it's, again, mostly hot and sometimes rain, and maybe gets a little bit cold now and then, the four seasons don't really apply. And the game gives a bunch of alternative ways, like if your area might have like tornado season, you have changelings that have drastically different emotional highs and lows and chaotic natures, or how the summer court might be split into two different summer seasons to reflect local conditions. Personally, I never felt the need to adopt something like that despite having a game in Phoenix. I just ran with the four standard seasons and I said, well, the way they figure out how that works is they just go off the equinox and solstice.
Right.
Easy enough for them to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea, but and the alternate seasons they give here are still variations of the existing four seasonal courts. So it's like, they're not fully disengaging from this. But I like the note that what matters is it's the regular change of power that the gentry don't get. It's not the trappings around that idea which matters so much. So I think that was important. And having mantles for the alternate courts is a cool move. I also wanted to note this is one of the easier pieces of the Lost setting to port into Dreaming, is to have seasonal or alternate courts. So a lot of people, myself included, have done that.
Oh, I did not know that. That's cool.
Book of Days.
Directional courts. Shall we talk about them?
Yeah, let's do it.
So the idea here is that while the seasonal courts are the most common in the Euro-American areas, that in other areas they have other court systems may dominate, or they might use the seasons. One of the alternatives is the directional courts. The other will be the courts of sun and moon. We'll talk about the directional courts first, which is the idea of you take the four cardinal directions and their mythic guardians, and then draw symbolism from regional traditions, Asian myths, and Buddhist ways in order to form these court structures. They don't hand off power over the course of the year. They share it year-round, getting together to settle issues. And like with the seasonal courts, that they just don't get the idea of people choosing to share power when you could choose to take it. They have a nice suggestion here that if you like this idea, you could apply it to other locations with similar mythology, including, and I did not know this, the idea of the four evangelist beasts from Christian mythology associated with the four gospel writers, I think. I just thought that was a interesting touch. I did, by the way, ask my partner, who's native Thai, about like, do you think this applies here? Because the book calls out Thailand specifically, and her thought was like, I don't know if we really do anything with the four mythic guardians thing, and also I'm not sure what I think about the seasonal thing. So
yeah,
the answer is I could not honestly tell you how broad the directional courts would have their appeal. The concept itself seems interesting, though. The part I find most curious is the Demon Gate to the northeast.
Right?
Which is this trod that's going to lead to somewhere horrible and always exists. If for no other reason, I think that's the coolest reason to have a directional court.
This was a new concept to me, and I do want to follow up on my own research looking into this, because That sounds really interesting.
I'll give my quick notes on the 4 courts. So we have the court of the north, east, south, and west. The northern court believes in destroying attachments to things. The idea being that if you destroy everything that the true Fae could care about first, they have nothing they can attack you thereby. I actually really dislike this court because I feel like it maybe misses the point of the Lost having a healthy response to things. Like, to contrast it with the Winter Court, where the idea is that you understand like the suffering and sorrow that you're going through and you try to deal with that in a healthy way. This feels more like the Winter Court's equivalent of how the militia is to the Summer Court, because they want to get rid of anything that could possibly attach you to the world and be used to help the true Fae. I get the concept and I understand where they're getting the idea from, but I don't think it works very well as a court. Oh, I should say their emotion is they get power from watching the suffering of others. The court to the east is the court of wealth. They use this to do things just like seize temporal control, which in turn gives them the ability to take control over the hedge portals and other things in the material world that may cause issues for changelings of other courts or in other freeholds. They use their fairy magic to acquire wealth, selling tokens, their own bodies, beautiful dreams, etc. Curiously, it says they're set up as a pyramid scheme, which felt like that came out of nowhere for me. Their mantle reflects wealth, helping them wheeling and dealing. Their emotion is envy, not greed, which seems surprising. The court to the south, I really like these ones. This is the court of ecstasy. They indulge in all emotions, good or bad, as powerfully as they can. They see their magic as true art, which they must study and refine. They tend to be literal artists. Their heraldry revolves around the phoenix and an ink brush. Their mantle inspires strong emotions in others. And yes, their court emotion is ecstasy. And finally, the Court of the West, which is kind of similar to the Summer Court. They believe that permanent peace is impossible, and they emphasize a virtuous warrior ethos. They try to be cold-hearted and disciplined in all they can do, often fetishizing the weapons that they use in their conflicts. They are heavily ritualized, which is how they keep their clarity, and rituals with everything from polishing weapons to the bigger things that they do are integral to this for them. Their emotion is honor, which is understood as doing something difficult or dangerous because it is the appropriate thing to do so. And then finally, the contracts, the 4 directions, are odd because compared to what we get for the seasonal courts, it feels a little underwhelming. You don't get fleeting and eternal, you just get a single set of 5 contracts about helping people find or lose their place in the world.
The central concept of the contracts of the 4 directions for me was spatial harmony, understood in different ways. I thought was how I conceptualized it. Yeah, I mean, they're cool, but they're still kind of seasonal. Really, to your point about whether or not this is grounded in real folklore, I think what's grounded in is Kindred of the East. And what drove that home for me was the reuse of the Kindred of the East fonts at different points for the headers here.
Oh, dear.
Court of the South is basically just the Thrashing Dragons and so forth. But, they've got cool mantles. I like the different emotions that they dove into here. And meh. Would you use them in a game?
If I was doing the 3 Kingdoms of Darkness, which is a dark era set in the Warring States period of China, they have a nice long write-up of them, which takes this and kind of updates it. Or I might enjoy doing a 40 Evangelical Beasts one and just, just be like, cool, we're going to take something based upon a freehold's very, very changed version of Christian mythology and them just going all in on that one and seeing what they do with that.
Well, and there's Christian folklore too. I mean, for sure. that you could draw on.
Right. And I think you'd have a lot of fun with that. But I don't know. I mean, I find that there's so much more written about the 4 seasonal courts, including crunch for them, that it's really hard to get away from that. And it's easy enough to do anywhere. Even if the seasonal courts don't make sense in the context of Phoenix, Arizona, for example, it's still something which is easy enough to apply. And putting that in a location where they don't necessarily make sense can just be an odd curio. So,
well, and it's worth pointing out that these 2 sections start with a note on supplanting courts and kind of constructing a story arc around these foreign systems intruding on what the freehold in your game is used to. So you can actually build around that possible transition and have like some who want to adhere to the seasonal courts and some who want to adhere to this new thing, the directional courts, because they want to change things up. So I think that's an interesting way to approach it. Also, the font size kept changing. I got really frustrated with that.
oh no.
So then after that, we get the section entitled The Courts of Day and Night, but we're actually going to be talking about the Courts of Sun and Moon. These are drawn from Eastern European and Slavic mythology. They have a simple directive. The day court rules the day, the night court rules the night. And they are in active opposition with endless war across almost every domain, but they draw the line at murder. There's a note on introducing these in a setting with a large Slavic population, and then another note saying that this duality exists in many other contexts as well, including Seelie-Unseelie. So this seems like a much more universalizable kind of system that you can do. I also dig the idea that this setup of day and night thwarts the Fae, because the night-day cycle as a cycle is strange to them. In Arcadia, it's often just daytime or nighttime. There's a note that younger Lost don't understand the bigger picture of balance that their constant struggle fits into, which is useful as an idea for any competitive court system, I would say. And they don't exactly talk about the variation in rule length as the seasons shift, but that's also something to think about. So the Sun Court spends its days actively undoing the efforts of the Moon Court and or trying to do virtuous things, even if they must commit immoral acts to serve their own idea of justice. They want to make a difference, whether it's from altruism or revenge. They celebrate Kupala Day at the summer solstice, it's a holiday of romance, and they exact exquisite punishment on oathbreakers during storms in honor of the god Perun. They have a bright and shiny mantle, which bolsters their fierce righteousness and helps them expose shame and guilt as their core emotional connection thing. I expected more about the shame of the court themselves, actually. Like, I like the idea of them being ashamed of the acts they do, but then covering it up with their righteousness, and I kind of wanted an exploration of that. But
And it is worth noting that while most join up because they want to do good, there's some who join up because they want to abuse the position of righteousness. So they take it on for the same reason that a lot of people become cops, where it's like, well, I'll be seen as an authority figure and nobody can tell me that I'm wrong. Oh dear.
yeah.
Also, the court often rejects people just because they are ugly.
Yes. Oh, yeah,
They don't fit whatever the court considers conventionally attractive, which, wow.
Well, and that is kind of like in a lot of folklore, you see that idea of a blemish or some kind of disfigurement signifies monstrosity, or something like an Irish myth, the king can't have any blemish or he's not allowed to rule. So those ideas coming through is an interesting aspect.
So given that the Sun Court seems like that's where you would go if you think of yourself as a good person, why would somebody want to join the Moon Court?
Well, the Moon Court is just more fun. They spend their nights doing their own thing as self-important monsters, usually just pushing boundaries and casting sin as freedom. They hide underground during the day. They're ugly and tricksy and selfish, but rarely strictly evil. They accept everyone, especially those too supposedly immoral or just ugly for the Sun Court. Their celebrations include Korochun at winter solstice as a time of excess. At any time, really, they celebrate leading humans astray. They have a shadowy mantle that facilitates their vices, and they luxuriate in disgust. So basically, it's like Hyper Seelie versus Shadow Court is really what we're looking at here.
How do you like that distinction? I think it's great.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, if you're going to have that kind of duality in the game, might as well play it up. And this is, as we said before, the story that we saw at the beginning connects into this system. So we see it model.
Which court do you want to join? I'm telling you right now, I would have to go Moon Court because it's the court of the degenerates. Like, you know.
No, absolutely the Moon Court. Because the thing with the Moon Court is you don't have to, and this is what we say about the Unseeling Dreaming a lot, you don't have to be awful and cruel and foul towards people. You can just enjoy your life. So.
While the Sun Court feeds off of shame, the Moon Court feeds off of disgust. And the distinction is that shame is about the person experiencing shame at what they themselves have done, whereas disgust is about what the witnesses feel, not the actor. I thought that was a nice nuance.
Yeah.
Also, I have used a court similar to this setup. In my own game's lore, there is the Heaven and Hell Court in a nearby city, with the distinction being not over night and day. They base themselves upon, like, angels and demons. But they agree that they'll resolve all disputes by betting on mortals, rather than doing direct confrontation. And that is what the Fae cannot understand. Why would you ever put things in the hands of a mortal? They're immortal.
Yeah. Anything to confound the Fae's understanding is worth trying, I would say. But that little sidebar at the end of page 142 about elephant and donkey hits a little too close to home these days.
We got 3 entitlements.
Yeah. We have the Phantom Tongue criminal organization, who believes that its illicit activities and the seedy underworld it supports keeps the courts honest, or at least on their toes. Some are Robin Hood types, fighting corruption by tempting it out of others, but most seem to be just in it for the crimes. They have a pretty predictable image of drug lords and crime bosses, obviously with connections to their mortal counterparts worldwide, and their privilege as an actual criminal network.
Yeah, I didn't really get much of a care out of them. It's like, nope, they're a criminal entitlement.
Yeah, spoiler, okay. I didn't really like any of these. The Bronze Beylik is from the former Ottoman area. They are forbidden to rule, so they proudly work as kingmakers for the courts. They believe that their number are chosen by fate to do so, but they still have to pass these wild tests to get in, or they can just find a spearhead, which we'll get to in a second. They develop bronzed means and long hair or beards. They tend to be politically or socially savvy, and they set up shared domains in cities with a presence of their entitlement. Their privilege is a token bronze spearhead, which calls on Fey gloom and allows them to add weird to their intimidation. The one thing that I have to say here is, like, the little bit about them having clustered domains felt a little bit racist.
Yeah, I felt like that was drawing from some cultural tradition that I was not familiar with, and also maybe the author might not have been familiar with.
Well, just the idea of, here's someone who comes to a city and sets up a business, and now they bring in their friend or their cousin to set up another business. And before you know it, you have an ethnic enclave. And I'm like, yeah, and?
So, oh, dear.
It was a little tonally weird to me to kind of harp on that, but
I did like the general concept of them as these open kingmakers, because that seems like a great complication to throw into your freehold, where maybe the PCs are all supporting one person, and then these folks are like, yes, but we'll put this person in charge, and now you have to go deal with this entire entitlement. And also the part about the idea of their origins being against True Fae warriors and the bronze spearheads, pointing to that. It just seems like an interesting bit.
Lastly, we get the Knighthood of the Dragon Slayer. They follow a Brazilian changeling's example, who exposed and deposed corrupt courts in Sao Paulo who were working with the others. They're inquisitors, basically, rooting out those who are still connected to Arcadia. Joining means fully severing such ties, including killing off your fetch. They are keen-eyed and sharp-minded. Their mien becomes subtly draconic, and they largely act independently. Each of them has a cross token that lets them sense sin and burn those with low morality.
That cross token is ridiculously good. It is automatic lethal damage.
Yeah. No, they're the ones that I would say I would be most drawn to using in a game, probably as lost antagonists. They don't necessarily fit into the categories we had in Autumn Nightmares of the Mad and the Loyalists and all of that, but I like them as someone your characters will have to deal with.
I agree. I think that they make an interesting foil to the PCs. They think that they are doing something good for the freehold, but, I mean, They torture people.
Yeah, they're like the White Cloaks in Wheel of Time. And then the chapter and the book just kind of end. So for the chapter, I mean, it's kind of a scattershot that covers a lot of ground. They really wanted to lean into the theme of multiculturalism here. And even though there are aspects of their approach that I think could have been handled with more delicacy, like I said, I suspect it was influenced by some of the criticisms sometimes leveled at Dreaming. But they do cover a wide variety of crunchy bits, and this is where I'm really happy to see something we've pointed to before. Complicating the politics of the setting is what I would want at this point, more than like the jumpstart adventure for the entire game. Because by this point in the line, players are familiar with the courts, players are familiar with the dynamics between them. So now you can kind of make that a little bit more nuanced and provide alternatives, I would say.
I do like that this book added a lot more detail for pretty much everything. The core book, while I appreciate that it wants to leave things vague, I really struggled when I first picked up Changeling because I could not translate that into something practical at my game table. And having a book that gives me a lot of direction, as much or as little as I want, I can go anywhere from as vague as the general guidelines on the seemings to as specific as looking at the folkloric inspiration for the Far Walker and just being like, hey, look, our whole point was you want to play a Sasquatch, you can play a Sasquatch.
Give me my Bigfoots. Yeah.
Overall, I think that it's my favorite supplement so far. I liked the stuff that I got out of Autumn Nightmares, but the general information here I found to be more useful, and I think it's going to be very exciting for players. The only really disappointing stuff is that I feel like the stuff on the other courts is maybe a little underbaked. Like I said, we don't actually get that much detail about how they function. We don't even get a set of contracts for the Sun and Moon court.
Yeah, that was surprising, I have to say. Given that we have one for the others, yeah. Yeah, I agree though. As a whole, I mean, despite the clunky winter title, it functions well as a player's guide. Like I said before, maybe merits would have been nice and more concrete examples of intrasplat dynamics, because those are things I would expect to find in a player's guide, and they didn't have those. I also miss the days when they used to have actual essays in player's guides about like the action of role-playing. But there's so many scraps of advice and story hooks mixed in here that I think the mood is present. So I liked that. Putting aside occasional repetitive writing and the occasionally awkward advice about poaching folklore, it feels like it expands just the right number of things to the right amount. It's the right length of book for doing what it sets out to do. So I appreciated that. I think we've talked enough about this book.
This book took way longer to talk about. I don't understand how that happened. I'm confused. I don't understand.
It's that moving boundary of Arcadia that we spoke of. You're just always another few minutes from the end. In any case, so let me go through our usual passel of links. Speaking of approaching boundaries and whatever, if you would like to get in touch with us, you have a number of options. You can find us on Discord at discord.me/CTP. You can send an email to podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. We are on Facebook and YouTube under Changeling the Podcast. Mastodon is changelingpod at dice.camp. And you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Links to all of these will be in the show notes to this episode. And I've been Puka.
And I've been Fetch. The masquerade is at an end.
Yes.
We zoomed in on the pages of the PDF for this book to discover that there was in fact an even greater surfeit of seeming, kith, and court options described, at a font size too small to be seen with the naked eye. Perhaps your beast or elemental escaped from the Arcadian realm of histamenia, where fae are shaped into allergenic plants and animals. You might consider taking the fairest's contracts of sass and swagger, or choose rare occupations like stoolgroom or swankeeper for your wizened. And if none of the alternative courts visible at normal-sized screen view interest you, why not the culinary courts of the Three Squares, who divide up their rulership around daily meals and battle constantly against the rebels of the Elevenseas Viscount's entitlement and the militia of the Midnight Snack? The eye strain we undergo to spot these secrets for you, the listener, is eased by treatments we can afford through the support of our patrons, so with blurry vision, we extend our heartiest thanks to Bad Company, Derek, Dorcadus, Elrus, Hugo the Bogperson, Ia Bull, Jason Vines, Oreo, Roz Caboose, Sadjigger, Zija, and Simon Strand. If you'd like to join their ranks and get a shout-out each episode, please consider signing up at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. We also welcome reviews on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience. Until next time, may your masks be wintry and your timekeeping courtly while you keep on dreaming.